Well, hi, my name is Rhonda Rashay Penrice. I'm a member of the African American Film Critics Association, and we are so delighted to present this program, AAFCA and the Alliance of Women Directors, our special Women's History Month program featuring the amazing filmmakers Lisa Cortes and Don Porter. You know their most recent works as of this taping as for Don Porter, John Lewis, Good Trouble. Well, actually, it's not your most recent. The way I see it, right, is the most recent. But we're going to focus on John Lewis, Good Trouble, and for the amazing Miss Cortez. We are so excited about your role in bringing All In, the fight for democracy, um, to fruition, which a lot of us attribute to the Biden Harris administration. So, one of the ways I want to kick it off, and I want each of you brilliant women to talk about how you started with these particular projects. So, I guess since we'll do it alphabetically, and Ms. Cortez, you can go first.
Sure. Well, All In the Fight for Democracy, which looks at the long tail of voter suppression and voting rights, particularly as it affects people of color, specifically Black folks, from the inception of this country. It was the baby of Stacey Abrams. After the 2018 gubernatorial run, a lot of filmmakers approached Stacey about telling her story. And she actually decided that she wanted to not focus on her journey, but more importantly on the history and kind of how the past is always a prelude to the moment that we find ourselves in now. So, Stacey, it was not only our North Star as filmmakers with this project, she's also a producer on the project and lent so much to the structure, the access, and the realization of the film.
And for you, Dom?
I had done a series about Bobby Kennedy for president, in which we interviewed Congressman John Lewis, and he gave this incredibly emotional interview and told this story about organizing a rally for Bobby Kennedy that was to recur in Indianapolis, but it was on the day that Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, was killed. And it was a story that I didn't know. I didn't know that it was John Lewis who would organize that rally. And it was also John Lewis who told Bobby Kennedy that he needed to speak to Black people that day because Kennedy's white advisors were saying, don't do that. It's going to be dangerous. There's going to be rioting. You won't be safe. And a very young, in his 20s, John Lewis said, you must speak to people. You must address their pain. Kennedy took the advice of his youngest advisor. He spoke to the Black community that day. It is widely thought of as one of the best speeches that Kennedy ever gave. But when I heard that, I thought, there are so many more stories about the congressman that we don't know. And we just think of him in the 60s, and he's an active participating legislator. That I want to draw that connection between his early life as an agitator to his current life agitating in Congress. So I was thinking about that, and then CNN came and asked me if I was thinking about that, and CNN said, "Hey, what would you do with John Lewis?" And I said, "This is what I would do." And so it was sometimes, and Lisa can vouch for this. Sometimes it's just the time for the movie to happen. Sometimes all of the pieces align. So like obviously Stacey Abrams' film needed to be made, even if she didn't think it was the time for her film. You know, there's that is in the world. Those stories are in the world, and I think what I love about Stacey Abrams, what I love about John Lewis, is seeing the process of how you get from here to there. Stacey doesn't just show up and become a force in the political landscape. She has been working her behind off for a decade to get us into a structural place for success. And I feel very much like that is very similar story for Congressman Lewis. He didn't just show up on a bridge. Those people trained, and they were not just brave, they were strategic. And so far too often the portrayal of civil rights leaders focuses on their bravery, focuses on their bodies instead of on their minds. And I think John Lewis was underestimated his whole life. Um, and really what he was, among so many other things, was a brilliant strategist. And that's what Stacey Abrams is. So I love how these movies speak to each other and how this work speaks to each other in these past few years.
And Donna, you know how much I love you and your work. And with Good Trouble, it's so interesting. You know, we oftentimes want to look at these movement leaders and ascribe this just add water. Poof, it all happens, right? But it is such a long journey. And I love how you centered his mind and all of the incremental steps that begats a Stacey Abrams, it begats a Raphael Warnock. Because it's sometimes in the telling of our history by others, by filmmakers who don't look like Dawn and I, they are the protagonists are kind of circumscribed and limited, and the long tail that they come from and then they then contribute to is compromised.
Yes, it's very interesting because a lot of times, the people are extracted from the long the long struggle. And, as we know, this fight has been going on for centuries. It's not even a 20th century and a 21st century phenomenon. It's a continuum.
That is so true. I'm working on a film now about Red Summer and the Tulsa and the massacres that are not only in 1917 but continued through 1923. 26 cities across this country had race massacres by mobs of white people indiscriminately killing black people. And when you look into that history, what you see is soldiers returning from World War One, black soldiers saying, "We fought admirably. We want our rights in our own country." And the violent response to that. So the NAACP was formed in response to violence against black people in 1908. So, I think I love the 60s. I'm going to stay in the 60s for a long time. But now that we're going back and seeing, like, and I feel like, people say, like, oh, is this so depressing? And I actually feel appropriate anger, but I feel like it's restorative because I see how long my people have been asserting themselves and refusing to be put down in the face of just horrific violence and adversity. It really does give you a sense of pride. That is what I'm coming away with. And I think Lisa is right about, and you're right, Rhonda, about like how you frame these stories is so important. I do not want to frame this as a victim class. We are framed as a fighting class. Maybe we don't always win the fights because it's not possible with the massive backlash against us, but we fight. We've always been fighting. And that's the long legacy story that I hope is going to reframe for my children and for all the generations going forward how they feel about themselves and the people that they come from.
Don, it's funny that you say that because I've been thinking a lot about this trope of resilience in our story. Whether others are frightened of it or not, we have continuously had to exist in a place of weaponization. And despite the targeted oppression, there is resilience, there is movement, and that is the joy in the stories that we have been telling, of of rising up and finding a path forward despite a cyclical history. You know, what happened on January 6th, we have seen many, many times.
I mean, Lisa, when you see there's a photograph, there's not footage, but there's photographs of white people storming the city hall in Chicago, climbing into the windows to pull out a black man who is being hidden there, and the mob will not stop until they pull him out, lynch him, dismember him, burn him, and drag his body to the black section of town. Those images, you could literally put January 6 people in place of those images and see it did not, well, I was about to say it didn't lead to death, but it did lead to death. There were, what, 7 people who were killed?
What
So
year was this?
this was in the 1910s, like in the 1919, that Red Summer era in Chicago, in the place where we were going for freedom. So, but the other piece of that story is the Black people marching and organizing and marching and showing up and, challenging and refusing to be silent about that violence. And that's a part of the story we don't see enough of. So, anyway, we got off on a long tangent, but
But we are centered in resilience and joy.
And so, you guys bring up a very good point. As women filmmakers in particular, when you're coming with that POV, like what kinds of obstacles have you faced in bringing these, restorative narratives to the mainstream?
I think, I want to be careful here not to sound too naive, but I haven't really found that much resistance to it when it's braised. It's that those perspectives are not raised. We don't talk about resilience resist. We talk about victim. And so if you raise it, people are like, "Oh, that's interesting." It's just that the people telling the stories before didn't raise it. So I'm thinking of like this current project and John Lewis movie and and so many others. So I would not say there's a resistance to that story, which has the benefit of being the truth. It's like instead of focusing this camera over here towards like people being killed and beaten and smashed over the head, focus it over here where they got up. So I haven't found resistance to it, but we have to get to the point where we're being hired to tell those stories. So that's what I think.
It's not so much a resistance. What I do think that's happening in the recentering is making certain that the contributions of our mothers, our grandmothers, our sisters are given equal parity in the storytelling. There's a natural inclination to lean into the larger than life male figures who traditionally there's much more documentation and information on them. And so it is a resistance against a historical narrative that I think that we encounter, and that, Dawn in her work, myself, we are saying, wait a minute, we want to illuminate also the women who have been in lockstep for this important and necessary change.
I think that that's a really, really critical point, which is what Lisa's saying, which is it's a resistance to the historical understanding, the understanding that has not been challenged. And so I see a lot of what I'm trying to do is filling in those pieces that were obscured before. You can't understand the full story if you don't know what the women were doing, if you don't know what the Black people were doing, if you don't know what the people who are not famous all did, because nobody gets to any place great by themselves. So
speaking of getting to the full story, I know as people are watching, they're curious about how each one of you entered into this endeavor of filmmaking. So please share that story of your individual journeys.
Well, what I love about my origin story is that I guess I was always moving to this place, but I didn't know that. I started out in the music industry, working with incredible hip hop artists in the golden age. I then went into narrative storytelling and now documentaries. But the connective tissue is always that I've wanted to make visible, uh, invisible voices, voices that I believe, though, shape history and move culture forward. So whether it's working with Public Enemy in the early days, or a film like The Woodsman, and Precious, to the remix and All In, it's always about characters, voices who have not had a platform to be represented with full dimensionality and also interiority, and making certain that the authenticity of their voices and their stories is given a platform, that's like what's my connective tissue. And I think also the process of finding artists, developing them, making albums, it's somewhat similar to what you do in with creating narrative and documentaries. It's a similar thing of what is the IP, what is the content, how are we going to realize it in a unique way, and then present and market it.
Yeah, my background is it's interesting, Lisa. I'd like to hear you describe that because, a commonality is I also didn't foresee this for myself as a career. I was a lawyer. I am a lawyer. I went to law school. I represented newspapers. I went to ABC Television. I worked in-house at ABC Television and then ABC News. And I, kept coming closer to being the storyteller instead of making the other storytellers' dreams come true. But it was, and I just wonder about that. If I just wasn't seeing, there's a lot of reasons why I didn't say I'm going to start in film. One was I had to pay bills. I didn't have like, that was not in my dream for myself to not be able to pay my student loans. So, if you're raised where you have to pay your bills, like that's being secure about that is I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to make sure I can pay my bills. So, that's something that we should all think about is like the economics of doing what we do. There is a world in which you can make a good living doing this, even with documentary. But the here to there is hard because the here to there involves getting enough projects under your belt so that people can trust you with the bigger budgets. So Lisa's an executive in the music business, is a very skilled manager. I think for both of us, we were using those skills and that reputation of you don't have to worry about giving us a lot of money. We know how to manage projects that are with a lot of money. And that is very different than if you start out as an associate producer and you're kind of working your way through the normal tracks. Those kind of opportunities don't come along enough for Black and Brown folks. We don't have the ability to be interns very often for years or to not be able to pay our bills. So I think both of us, it's interesting that we were both executives in other disciplines before being where we are, but here we are.
And I can't imagine you doing anything else. It's like, I know you're a lawyer, but it's like, no, she's a director. And, a lot of it has to do with what, paying our bills, what we got from our parents, and giving ourselves permission to be an artist.
And to say that out loud, because that's a scary thing to say. It sounds kind of presumptuous and precious. And, I was raised with that you have to earn your title. You don't declare yourself something and then you it. You have to, and I think that a lot of Black and Black, I mean, I hate to generalize, but I do think a lot of us have that. It's a remnant, it's a byproduct of discrimination, which is we always are proving ourselves. So you don't go announcing yourself as something that you don't feel you can prove. And how can you can't do that as a very young filmmaker who has no credits, you know? So that's not how I was raised. I was raised as like you earn your stripes, and then you know whatever comes. But I think that that puts you at a disadvantage. I say to young women in particular now, I'm like, you know, who tell me, you know, they want to produce. I'm like, producing is great, but just do you want to direct also? And you're not saying it. Just like really think about what you want to do. And some people are like, yes, I want to produce. I'm a good manager. I'm a good creative. I like to do multiple projects. Great. Go find your joy, find your path. But I see a lot of young women who take themselves out of the director path because they think they're not ready. Whereas the guys of all races are like, they got an iPhone and an idea and they got business cards to say I'm a director. So, you know, I think
Lisa,
that that's a conversation to have for young creatives.
and Lisa, talk about that because you originally started out producing, right? So when did you make the leap to wanting to, not even wanting, knowing you could direct?
And by the way, I just have to say, everybody wanted Lisa to produce for them and still does. So, you know, that's also a heady thing when you're so good at something, you know, okay, just because I'm so good at it, does it mean it's what I should do? So I'm just curious because I think Lisa found a lot of joy in producing and really set a great model for being a creative producer, you know, but I'm curious to hear about like, are you going to produce again? I'm just basically interviewing her for a job.
Well, yes, you know, so it's interesting. So many of the projects I direct, I'm also on as a producer. And there are projects, particularly in the narrative space now that I'm looking at, that I'm solely a producer. And I think, you know, that's part of my DNA that I'll never be divorced from. You know, I think a couple years ago, there was a convening at the Ford Foundation, and Carrie Mae Weems was speaking, and she said, well, will all the artists in the room stand up? All of a sudden, something magically made me rise. And I am so grateful to that moment where I decided I wasn't going to be the whisperer, you know, and that because I think a lot of times as a producer, we are a director whisperer, we're the whisperer to all the departments, because we're finding ways to move it forward and make our days and hit our milestones. And and also that it's a safe place, because I think we know traditionally, you know, as Black women directors, the rooms that we go into have historically not been looking or checking for us. But there's such great joy in directing, and I think the first step that I took was with a project called the Remix Hip Hop Times Fashion, because I saw these projects about hip hop culture, and no one was talking about women to the extent that I felt women should be included in the narrative. And because I had been there for years, I was just like, I want to tell this story. I want to find a way into illuminating the incredible contributions to the culture that women made. And with the remix that started that process, I co-directed with someone, and that really it energized me that I could do this, and that my ideas could find an audience and resonate, and not only give me the personal joy, but also that of people who are like, you know, empowered by knowing of this possibility.
And also talk about, a lot of times when we think of the documentary space, because it is dealing with history, people think it's limited. When I myself, I'm the author of African American History for Dummies and soon to be Black American History for Dummies. And so I find so much creativity and freedom in the truth. Can you guys address that?
Yeah, I think it's the opposite of limiting. I think it's what you see in the documentary space is so much freedom. And I think it's been broken out of the traditional, you know, kind of slower, eat your vegetables kind of situation into Lisa uses animation, people are using poetry, on-screen graphics, musical moments. The film Time is a great example of a lyrical, visual, memory film. So, the other key thing is it's the barriers to entry are much more manageable in documentary. So you can go off and really, start your creative vision and then just announce it and then start to get your merry band of travelers to go with you. So you can start, and I think actually people are encouraging us to think outside of the box in films these days. So this is a great time for filmmakers to be thinking. And actually, if you think of some of the most successful narrative films these days, they look like documentaries. I mean, if you look at Nomadland, it looks
Mhm.
like a documentary. And it turns out she used non-actors and let people that's what we do. We follow people around, let them share their real experiences. So, I'd almost say her film is a hybrid documentary as much as it is a hybrid, feature film.
I
ex-
completely agree.
Except she probably got more money to make it than we would
And
get.
it's
So,
interesting you bring that up because one of the things, like Zora Neale Hurston was actually a trailblazer in that kind of space, but because she was doing anthropological work, she doesn't get credit as a filmmaker. And
yeah,
what you just described, what happened on Nomadland, is very consistent with some of the films that Zora Neale Hurston made.
that's right. Thurgood Marshall, what part of the way that he did research for his Brown v. Board of Education, separate and inherently unequal, is he went south with a camera and made those similar types of, I guess at the time they were called anthropological films, but they were films. And part of it was what he innately understood is seeing the difference. It was indisputable about the conditions, but there's something more that you see actual people and how their conditions impact their dreams, and that's something that's hard to write, but it's so much easier to show. And that's very much like influenced me a lot, is thinking about no one's going to be moved by lecturing finger, but they will be moved by a connection to an experience. And how do I give fullness to the experience so someone can feel something?
Yeah, accessing the empathy is always the driver. Because it differentiates it from being a lesson to being something that our audience becomes engaged with. And it's always a challenge, I think, when we set out to make our stories. I mean, I love, in Dawn's film, when Congressman Lewis is sitting there and he's seeing that incredible footage and of himself and these moments he hadn't seen before, because in real time we are brought to that place, but also to his interaction with it.
Now, can we talk about, is there still resistance in, making films, even documentaries, solely on Black women in particular? Have
Hmm.
you encountered that? Is there, a specific, Black woman focused project you may have wanted to make in this particular space outside of Stacey Abrams? Um, have there been challenges in that way?
I'm a Capricorn.
So you're just gonna
I'll give
bulldoze
up.
any obstacles.
And so, I think what you sometimes have to work with is, it's not the $3 million project, it's the 1.5 or the 900,000. You have to, sometimes your scale of changes. But I think that applies to a lot of projects that people are trying to get made. And what I always say to the team is, you know what, let's sharpen this up so that we can get the 3. Let's sharpen this up that for people who don't know about this person or their importance, they will get the necessity of this story, its connection to the zeitgeist, and how they will want to be a part of it.
Yeah, and I think I was really encouraged to see the Polly Marshall film made, and thinking that if that can get made, that to me is a game changer, because that is not a woman who, I haven't seen the film yet. I admire those filmmakers. They are not women of color, but how they got that film made, I'm really eager to hear the story of that. And I have nothing but love for the fact that they pursued that story, because I'm sure that that was not easy. And I know that they had a hard time getting RBG made. So for them to then say, okay, I'm going to go that next, I think that's kind of badass.
I think that's why they're doing Julia Child next.
Yeah, it's a little like, let's go downhill. Let's push this boulder downhill this time.
Well, I mean, they were able to get Polly Murray's story because
Yeah.
when they were doing RBG, they found so much of her influence and impact, and they had never heard of her. And so as they like opened up, this Pandora's box, and almost literally, because when we talk about Polly Murray, we're talking about a woman who was very pivotal to both civil rights and, women's rights at large, who was also an LGBTQ trailblazer. And so, now that people are seeing her story and as it rolls out, it does open up the possibilities. And, and speaking of that, do you guys have a dream, like woman focused project? I know that, you bring who you are to everything you do, but I'm just curious.
I mean, my dream is definitely Ida Wells, but like as a narrative, big ass movie. I mean, her story, like you can't make it up, like parents died in the cholera epidemic. She raises her 4 siblings. She finishes college, children of slaves, like goes on to do the Red Record, investigating lynchings herself. There's stories of her sneaking back south after being run out of the South and having her printing press burned down to the ground, traveling through Europe. She started kindergarten for Black children in Chicago. She brought her nursing. You could tell, like, read a lot, and I wrote my senior like legal law school thesis about her. So I've been thinking about her since 1993. But each was one of the founders of the NAACP. Like, let's say the myth that the NAACP was only started by white people is untrue, and Ida Wells was right up in that mix. She had a running battle with Susan B. Anthony about motherhood, and because they were early 20th century women, they wrote letters to each other. And I found those original letters in the Library of Congress. Susan B. Anthony said, "You are a woman of particular skill, but you are consumed with raising your children." And she wrote, it was the original mommy wars. And she wrote back, "Don't have a mind about my personal. I'm as dedicated to the cause as you are. Step back." So when Susan B. Anthony disinvites her from marching in front of the White House with the white women, it was a personal affront because they were personal friends. And she's like, "You talk about sacrificing for the cause, and you would have me sacrifice my personhood for your cause." And she was like held to the no and sneaks in and marches with the Mississippi Convention, and nobody could stop her. The Southern women were going to refuse to march in the streets of Washington, D.C. if a Black woman joined them. And she said held to the no. So yeah, that's my dream.
There is a new book coming out. I don't know if you know about Dawn. Ida Be the Queen.
Yes, it's
out.
Is that
by her daughter? Is that by her daughter?
Her great granddaughter. I actually interviewed
Michelle Duster.
Michelle Duster.
Yes, yeah, it's a young adult book, but you learn so much more. And I already knew some of the things that she did, but it's like even even when you're like, she already did so much, she did even more.
She did even more, you know, like what didn't she do? And she had a loving marriage and, you know, a happy, like, home life. So, I mean, happy in terms of she did the things she wanted to do. She wanted to have children. She wanted to be married. She wanted to, you know, to do that club woman existence. I mean, she just is a phenomenal person in so many ways. So,
You, Lisa?
She would be very happy to have her story told by you. I feel that.
mm.
I am obsessed with Mary McLeod Bethune. I just feel that from Florida to the White House, her friendship with both Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, what she was able to do in terms of desegregation in the Army, Black women having a access to education. You know, she started a school. I mean, there's so many. It's interesting to hear the parallels there. And so, yeah, so she's someone that I am working on some things now that include her narrative.
Now, is yours documentary, or is it feature film?
It's more on the feature side.
Now, I know we're going to wrap soon, but talk about trying to make that leap, or the process and journey of eventually making that leap when you have a space in particular for your case, Dawn, where you've been kind of defined in this space and you're frankly at the very top of it. What are the kind of barriers to people seeing you differently? Or, I mean, I know you see yourself as a storyteller.
I think, you know, it'll be really interesting to come back in a couple years and see, because you're right. Like, you know, people have no problem now seeing me as documentary director. I think people are saying like, "Hey, do you want to do narrative films?" And you know, of course, the answer is yes, but it's a yes, but because I have no interest in waiting around 12 years for something to happen. And so that's the trouble for me is I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. Um, but I would love the idea, you know, the ability to like explore that fiction filmmaking for the right thing. So I think, you know, once you get used to not having so many gatekeepers in documentary, it's a little hard to, you know, to really think like that's a feasible option because like ain't nobody got time for that. So, you know, I'm thinking about it. I'm just not fixated on it. I feel very satisfied with what I'm doing and pushing myself in this realm. But I think I'm going to get to direct a feature, you know, narrative feature. I think that that's going to be in my future. I'm just not hung up on it, you know. So, like, I keep telling everybody in the world, like, I would love to make this Idaho movie, but like I want to make it right, you know, like it's no like cheapy teepy situation. I feel this woman in my soul kind of situation. So I almost want to make something smaller first just to like, you know, go through that thing. But I don't know. You know, I have been getting more and more people saying, "Hey, are you interested in doing this?" So, but not quite getting the right projects because you see how important it is. You know, one thing, you know, I'd love Lisa's opinion on this too, is we don't really get second chances. So if I don't pick the right project first, I feel like I'm not gonna get to be the white boy who has a flop and then gets a Marvel movie, you know, like that. I don't, I'm realistic enough to see that I don't think that that's happening. So I need to really choose carefully.
Absolutely. It's so strategic what we have done. It oftentimes look like, oh, they did this film or that, but there's actually, you know, I think a lot of thought, deep conversations with our trusted advisors about, shall we do this project as opposed to that one? And I'm enjoying this season, and I want to sit and savor it. There's so many stories that I'm interested in, and when and if the time comes to move on, um, I will step into it, but it has to be completely concur with Dawn. It has to be the right thing. Um, and there are no givens, in this business. But I think it's the same uh, counsel that has guided us. That's our own and those of our on our team that we have to lean into when we take that next step.
I know that this has become a kind of posh question, but sitting where you are now, what kind of advice would you have given yourself when you started out?
Trust and believe. Keep
Yeah.
your circle close. Build community, um, and have patience.
I agree with all that. And I would say, like, don't take notes personally, you know? Everybody's got a note, and it does not mean they think you're a bad filmmaker. Like, so you don't have to go get sent to your bed with every round of, like, feedback. Um, but I think also figuring out when to trust your gut. And there are some things I would have fought for harder if I wasn't self doubting, and that I think would have made films stronger. So, but that's all part of the process, is trusting yourself, knowing when to compromise. You never want to be that person who can't, listen, but sometimes, so just honing in faster on, this is a core thing that I feel, versus I don't want any notes, distinguishing those two responses.
Because sometimes you are right. You are absolutely
I
right.
know. And sometimes you're wrong. But most of the time I'm right. So, there's still some things I regret. And, like, I don't want to regret any things anymore, because, one thing you learn is all those choices that get made, nobody's like, oh, your producer fought for that. And they're like, Jane shouldn't have done that. They're like, why did you do that? And it's the worst feeling to have to defend something you didn't want to do, or to get criticized for something you didn't want to do. So, sometimes I have to push back and be like, you know what, it's really my name on this. And so if we're going to break a tie, like, you should think about the fact that it's my name on it. Because everybody wants your name on it, but then, like, it's got to be I got to live or die on my decisions, to the ones that are fundamental. So, it's that balance of being a good partner, but also, like, if I, get a little more room to be yourself.
That is such a great point, because it is your reputation, and it is, going to be interpreted as your vision, even if it was not. So fighting for that and holding your ground on that is very important. And do you guys think, because you came from a background where you already were front and center and knew how to take charge, that has aided you?
Absolutely. As an executive in the music industry, signing and developing artists, being in management, it wasn't like, oh, there was no room for the gray zone. We were moving forward, we were making the deal, we weren't. And, as someone who occupied that role as an A&R person, and then later as a label owner, I always was centered in that way, in the decision making process, because you can't be willy nilly. There has to, it comes back to my North Star analogy. There's always this North Star. You don't vary. You are moving. Your GPS is locked in.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you need to. you need to be comfortable taking some risks, and you need to get used to that feeling of being unsettled. It's very rare that you're like, this is exactly the way to go, and I feel completely peaceful about that, especially if somebody's challenging you. So, just being able to say, I'm gonna be comfortable with a feeling of anxiety about this decision. If I feel like it's right, I'm gonna withstand some like feeling of being unsettled. So I'll tell you a great example is like putting John Lewis on a stool in front of three large screens with footage. I didn't know if that was gonna work. And then like I just was like we were following him in a museum, and I watched him watching himself, and I had been really like thinking, how am I going to get him off script? Because he'd given so many speeches. He would say the same stories over and over, which I love the stories, but I wanted to go beyond that. And I watched him watch himself, and then he told a story I'd never heard before. And I thought, okay, that's what we should do. We should put him in his own museum of his own life, and then have him tell me the story and say like, bring me there, Mr. Lewis. What did you hear? What did you smell? What did you feel? Da, 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 da. And he just delivered it. He just went back in time. But at the time that I said, and Lisa knows, my producer Laura, who's fantastic and will move mountains for you. But I was like, I need you to rent a stage and construct three huge screens and get 50 people. It was like the largest expense. And she was like, okay. But then I, like, having put all that emotion, I had no idea if it was going to work. It was either going to work or be a disaster. So, like, sometimes you have to try those things. And then I was like, all right, or maybe everyone's going to laugh at me, literally, for putting this man on a stool in a dark screen on a play stage. And it's the thing that people talk about the most. So, um, sometimes you just have to take that risk if you and lean into it and really try and, but the thing is, if you're going to take a risk, don't go halfway. Just like swing for it, because there's nothing more obvious than a vision unfulfilled. So,
And what an
And I'm
incredible
so happy you did that, because it's one of my favorite moments that I think about a lot.
And I was going to say, what a wonderful gift you were able to give him, prior to him leaving, this earth, to, see the love and appreciation that's, in that film. And so, yeah, women, you brilliant, brilliant, genius women. Um, I am so enriched by hearing your stories, and I want people to leave. I want to know at this point, what is the joy you find in filmmaking? So please share, your joy, because what does it bring to you? What has it brought to you, considering that you have been in other paths before? What has this particular pivot, or, even the embracing of what I would feel is a calling, a destiny?
I love how it's provided a platform for my voice and my dreams to be externalized, and to have this incredible platform to do it upon.
yeah, I would say there is this moment when you're shooting something or editing something, and it's just that little bit is just so perfect, and it didn't exist before. And so I love that feeling of possibility. There's so much that can be created that just comes out of your head. And then I also really, really love collaborating with people who really want to collaborate, who are, they might have a little bit of something and then you add something to it, and then it's like great. So, one thing I'm really enjoying right now is being self confident enough to like take it all in from everybody else. Like, I don't have to box and show that I know what I'm doing anymore. And that is a freedom, because it allows you to push everybody else to give their best to it. And you can take it all in. And you're not having to prove yourself so much anymore. Like you can really sink into the collaboration. I'm really enjoying that right now.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your insight and your wisdom on behalf of the African American Film Critics Association, which is the largest group of Black film critics in the world, and the Alliance of Women Directors. So thank you, Lisa Cortes and Don Porter. Continue the struggle, continue the fight, continue showing us, especially young women and women who are not so young, that you can do this. You can really do this. Be creative, find your joy in it, and also to bring others into a vision and a fold of the world that we want to live in.
Yeah, and thank you to the African American film critics. You are vital to what we do, and you lift us up, and your support, it means a lot because, as we know, there can be fights in who describing who's privileged to tell what stories, and so I think like we feel seen. So thank you for being there. It's really vital what you do.
Yes, thank you, Rhonda. I second what Dawn said. We so appreciate and value your support and contributions to changing the lens of how our stories are reviewed and interrogated by people who have an intrinsic knowledge of what we are working to impart.
You guys are disruptors, and disruptors are not it's hard in the beginning. And so when people are so used to seeing the world in one way and they've only been presented it in one way, and you come along and say, no, no, we're experiencing it differently. There are groups of people who've experienced it differently, and here's the historical record showing you. There's a lot of resistance to that. So there's so much bravery on your parts. And, I do not take that lightly. And I must note that we're coming off an incredible year in 2020 where we saw the release of, Black women-led projects at a furious rate. Every month there was a considerable project released by Black women, and you guys were very much a part of that, I want to say phenomenon, but we're going to claim that as our new normal as we move forward.
Right. So Dawn had 2 films last year. I had 2 films. We're a little tired now, but we're keeping going.
And we're happy that you keep going. So thank you again for joining us. And it has been an absolute honor and pleasure to speak to you today.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye, guys.